Hello, my name's Elijah Wells, and today's review is Celine Song's new movie, Materialist. The movie follows Lucy, who's portrayed by Dakota Johnson as a former actress who becomes a matchmaker for a well-known matchmaking company called Adore. When doing some matchmaking, she stumbles across Harry, who's portrayed by Pedro Pascal, who is a really rich, super rich person who goes out on like really fancy, schwanky dinners with Dakota Johnson and has a very keen interest in her, despite the fact that she's a matchmaker. Well, along the way, Lucy bumps into John, being her ex, who's being portrayed by Chris Evans in this time, who's a struggling theatre actor who also works part-time as a waiter. So, well, in the midst of all that going down, her company that she works for, Adore, it gets hit with a pretty serious scandal. Celine Song, being already fresh off her debut film, being Past Lives, which came out just 2 years ago, which is a movie that essentially follows two Korean people who meet up again after 20 years of being apart from each other and pretty much looking back on their relationship. Has not just adorned like huge amount of acclaim at this point, but also is now already being considered one of the best films of the decade and also one of the best debut films of the decade so far. Particularly that Celine Song pretty much now has a much bigger budget and pretty much has not just one, not two, but three of the biggest stars at the moment, being Dakota Johnson, Chris Evans, and Pedro Pascal, who latter is having a really busy summer, not just with this film, but also with Fantastic Four and the upcoming Editing movie with Ari Aster directing it. What I particularly like about this movie, and of course her previous movie being Past Lives, is the juxtaposition of the characters and the environments they're in, and pretty much what the characters essentially have to go through, which is again some really interesting stuff. Like I mentioned, the juxtaposition, like of course the two boyfriends that Lucy has, John being a broke person that lives in a really crummy apartment, and of course shares it with roommates in his mid-30s, is a struggling theatre actor who has a part-time gig as a waiter. And of course, there's Harry, being portrayed by Pedro Pascal, who's this extremely wealthy person who, of course, eats at very nice, swanky restaurants, while John completely complains about how expensive parking is and how expensive fees are and restaurants are. Well, let's say Harry, again, lives in a massively, really well-decorated penthouse, which is like really well, nice and really decorated to look at. And of course, has a really nice interest of course, in Dakota Johnson's character being Lucy, which is again some really interesting stuff. And what is also more interesting is that for Chris Evans' character, even though he is poor, he is somewhat bizarrely really honest, to the point that you literally see him bleed out with his raw honesty, and particularly in a lot of his instances, like how vulnerable he is. Like he's just stripping it all off from him. Like, this is who I am as a person. And we have, of course, Pedro Pascal, who's incredibly rich and wealthy and all that, but deep down, particularly when he progressed more about the movie, he just wasn't really honest about himself, or just felt somewhat incompleted about himself. Like, he just wants more about his life. Like, even though he doesn't display his vulnerabilities throughout the movie, like Chris Evans' character did, but I feel like the juxtaposition of these two characters and weighing it against the matchmaker character being Lucy, I find that a very interesting choice that the character, particularly the main character, Lucy, has to navigate throughout the entirety of the movie. What I also do like, again from Celine Song, particularly what she did again in this movie as well as she did in Past Lives, is that not just how vulnerable and the amount of juxtaposition the main characters are in and how vulnerable they are, but it's essentially a case of that they are really, really self-conscious about their upbringing and their relationships and all that. It's just really interesting, in my opinion. Like, it is, of course, it is a lot more prevalent and definitely somewhat a bit in your face in something like Past Lives. I wouldn't say in your face, but it's definitely really at the foreground of that movie, being that the main characters are very conscious about themselves and conscious about their upbringings. Like, of course, there's Dakota Johnson, or Lucy, who pretty much grew up poor, wanted to be an actress, didn't go that well, so she's a really successful matchmaker. And of course, there's Chris Evans, who, again, who's aware that he is pretty much a broke person who wants to become an actor, but is also a waiter. But now he's in his 30s and he still lives in an apartment with some roommates. One of them's one roommate is a teacher. One of them is like some OnlyFans person, and of course. We have Pedro Pascal, who is pretty much aware that he pretty much had everything served out for him on a silver spoon. Like, he is just a super rich, wealthy person who works in some sort of like private equity firm, which he does explain in this movie. Like in something like in Past Life is about people being conscious about them, particularly the main female characters in a relationship with a white man in New York who the main character from Past Life moved from Korea to Canada, then to New York, and of course is married to a white person, while the friend from all these years ago has pretty much had a breakup and still lives in Korea and still is where he is, where she left off, which is again a bit of a really brilliant way of juxtaposition and writing as well as character development and all that, which is again really good way to demonstrate the differences between all the characters and make them somewhat three-dimensional, and how you display their vulnerabilities like something on your sleeve. And there's a subplot about the movie, which is about Adore, the company that Lucy works for. It gets hit with some very serious allegations, which I don't want to explain on this channel because it's better that you watch the movie yourself than me just give it to you as that. Because when the twist of the allegations come out against the company, it just hits you like a train or something. Like oh, okay, like. The movie does take a bit of a turn towards like psychological thriller at some points, as it does see Lucy pretty much lose pretty much her hope for the job, and pretty much she just isn't into that matchmaking thing anymore. As she just becomes more and more depressed, and she just has this massive episode of soul searching. Like, again, not to bring up juxtaposition all over again, but there was that one specific scene where Lucy and her boss, being Violet, who when they were discussing the Adore's situation regarding their legal situation, there was that one shot of Dakota Johnson in that meeting, just getting more and more depressed, while in the background, everyone at Adore, while the legal situation was going down, just celebrated that their clients just got engaged. Everyone's so happy and so cheery and so happy about it, and everyone's celebrating, while Dakota Johnson in the foreground just crumbles and more and gets depressed more and more, even when the group just breaks into the office and just celebrates even more, like, hey, we got another person engaged, and she looks completely out of it, like, And then she does eventually walk out very unceremoniously at best, which is again a really clever technique of juxtaposition, not just on the writing aspects of things, like I did said earlier, but also what's directly in front of you and what's in the background, or what's in the foreground as well, which is again really cool stuff. Like how you pull that off in a technical level. While Past Lives, in a more philosophical arena of things, it does majorly talk about fate and the choices we make in life, and of course when your friend of yours does reappear after essentially 20 or 10 years later down the line. For Materialists, it's a lot more broad, as in I feel like it's definitely the one idea being, why do people get married in the first place? Then it kind of just branches off and off to a point. I feel like the movie, when it comes to philosophy, more philosophical questions about why do people get married, I feel like it does lose focus a little bit, particularly when it does go around that arena. I feel like it does again lose focus and lose tracks of itself. To a point, it does get a titty bit muddled when it comes to the philosophical side of things. I'm not criticising Celine Song as a writer, even though her dialogue-heavy movies are really well written, particularly in this film and in Past Lives, but I feel like for Past Lives, there was definitely a much more clear-cut idea that was behind it, and definitely a much better execution. But for being fate and choices we make, for Materialist, there was definitely a solid idea being, why do people get married? I feel like I feel it just way too many ideas just came off of that simple question that I feel like it chose one too many answers to be a bit to the point it was basically a bit too comprehensive for a lot of people. And of course we have to acknowledge the performances in this movie, particularly with Dakota Johnson, who basically plays a matchmaker who becomes more and more delusioned by a job and pretty much goes on somewhat of a soul-searching side quest of some allegations being made to a company, which I feel like when that movie becomes when the movie is more of a romantic drama, she does really well as a performance in that. And when the film becomes somewhat psychological thriller, we do see more of a more vulnerable and more of a broken side of Dakota Johnson out of this movie, which again I really do like, but particularly. Again, a really good performance in that. And Chris Evans, who is having a bit of a struggling streak at the moment after something like Avengers Endgame and Knives Out, he had struggled to attain a consistent critical and box office form. But in this film, you actually do see him in surprisingly one of his better performances, like in recent memory. Like, he is actually really good in this performance, and basically as a struggling theatre actor, and he's a part-time caterer waiter, who basically lives in a crummy apartment where a condom was found on a floor, and he gets really agile and angry all of a sudden. Not in an abusive way, he's just a type of person that wears his vulnerabilities like a badge on his shirt, which is again some really extra props of playing an actor with vulnerabilities with sincerity at best. And of course there's Pedro Pascal, who, although despite being rich and handsome and all that, works in a private equity firm, he tries to bury all his vulnerabilities down. And particularly, I feel like Pedro Pascal does a pretty good performance in this movie, in my opinion. Like, I really do like how that character is written as a person who basically buries all his vulnerabilities and all his past problems downwards, while Chris Evans pretty much just brings it all, never really lets it bottle at all, while Pedro just tries to keep it down below the surface, which is again some really clever character ideas from Celine Song. Celine Song's sophomore piece, The Materialists, although there are definitely some issues, particularly in film's philosophical ideas about why do people get married, which does get a little bit overstuffed in that arena, but I feel like the acting of Dakota Johnson, Chris Evans, and Pedro Pascal is incredible in this movie. The writing, particularly as a dialogue-heavy movie, it pretty much carries the movie, and the quality of it is actually really good, the writing. And pretty much the ideas of why do people get married, even though it does get a little bit overstuffed and a little bit too overbearing at some instances, but I feel like Celine Song does shine in her biggest strengths in the movie, in her two films that she may be juxtaposition, regardless of what context you want to put it into. And of course, the other key string that she does already is characters are really conscious about their upbringings and where they came from, which again, although depicted brilliantly in Past Lives, it is depicted really well in Materialist as well. Even though, like I did say over, some of the questions can have a little bit too overstuffed answers out of it, but I feel like this is a really strong movie from already one of the biggest directors to emerge out of this decade already, and particularly her writing's incredible in her two movies, and the directing is of course incredible, particularly when it does pivot lanes into a different genre from romantic drama to psychological thriller. I feel like she does that pretty well in my opinion. So for The Materialist, I'm feeling a 7 out of 10. So, what do you think of Materialist? Let me know in the comments down below. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Threads, and Blue Sky. And this is Elijah Wells, and bye!